Voices from the grave. The house at the end of Hollowbrook Street had always been quiet, sitting on its hill like a forgotten relic. The Harrow family moved in, unaware of the history buried deep within its walls. For them, it was just a new start, a place to escape the fast-paced life of the city and reconnect as a family. George and Maria Harrow wanted a simpler life for their children, Emily and Jake, a place where they could grow up without the noise and distractions of modern life. They didn't realize that the noise they were escaping wasn't the kind they needed to worry about. It was a stormy October night when the first call came. George was in his study, leafing through some old papers for his work. The wind howled outside, and the rain lashed against the windows in a steady rhythm. Maria was upstairs putting the kids to bed, their laughter echoing faintly through the house. Everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful, when the phone rang. The landline sat on George's desk, a relic of an earlier time, almost never used. They had all relied on their cell phones for years, so the shrill ring of the old-fashioned phone startled George out of his work. He frowned, picking up the receiver, wondering who would be calling so late. As soon as he put the phone to his ear, a chill ran down his spine. The voice on the other end was faint, distorted by static, but unmistakably familiar. "George. George, is that you?" It was his mother's voice. But that was impossible. His mother had died 2 years ago. George's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the blood drain from his face as he listened. The voice was soft, but it carried a tone of urgency, almost desperation. "George, you have to help me. I'm lost." For a moment, he couldn't speak. His mind raced, trying to find some logical explanation. Maybe it was a prank, or maybe the storm had interfered with the phone lines. But deep down, he knew it wasn't either of those things. It was her voice. Every inflection, every tone was exactly as he remembered. "Mom," he finally whispered, his voice shaky. "Is that, how?" But before he could get an answer, the line went dead. The room was silent again, save for the storm raging outside. George stood there for a moment, the phone still clutched in his hand, his heart pounding in his chest. When Maria came downstairs, she found him staring blankly at the wall, the receiver dangling from his hand. "George. What's wrong?" she asked, concern in her voice. He turned to her, his face pale. I just got a call from my mother." Maria's brow furrowed in confusion. "Your mother? But, George, she's been gone for—" "I know," he interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it was her. I know it was." The next day, George tried to shake off the eerie feeling from the night before. Maybe he had been overworked, or maybe the storm had made him imagine things. But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the call had been real. He didn't tell the kids about it. They had just settled into the new house, and the last thing he wanted was to scare them. But he did mention it to Maria over breakfast. "Maybe it was a dream," she suggested gently, sipping her coffee. "You've been under a lot of stress with work and the move. It's not uncommon to hear things." George nodded, though he wasn't convinced. The voice had been so clear, so real. But he let it go, for Maria's sake. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, though there was a tension in the air that neither of them could quite explain. The house, which had felt like a peaceful retreat, now seemed heavier, as though something unseen lingered just out of sight. That night, as the family settled into their routines, the phone rang again. This time, Maria answered it. She had been in the kitchen, washing the dinner dishes, when the shrill ring pierced the quiet of the evening. She wiped her hands on a towel and picked up the receiver, expecting a telemarketer or a wrong number. "Hello." There was a pause, a crackle of static, and then a voice she hadn't heard in years. "Maria? Maria, darling, it's so good to hear your voice." Maria's hand flew to her mouth, her knees nearly buckling beneath her. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. But that couldn't be right. Her mother had passed away nearly 5 years ago. "It's been so long," the voice continued, soft and warm, just as Maria remembered. "I've missed you so much." Tears welled in Maria's eyes. "But, how?" The voice on the other end hesitated, as though struggling to find the right words. "It's cold here, Maria. So cold. You have to come. You have to help me." And then, just like the night before, the line went dead. By the third night, the tension in the Harrow household was palpable. George and Maria hadn't told the children about the calls, but they couldn't hide their unease. The house seemed darker, colder, as though the warmth it once held had drained away. The children, always so full of life, had grown quieter, more subdued. That night, after they had tucked Emily and Jake into bed, George and Maria sat in the living room, staring at the phone as though it were a snake ready to strike. "What do we do?" Maria asked, her voice barely a whisper. George shook his head. "I don't know. We can't just ignore it. What if they need our help?" Maria's eyes filled with tears again. "But how is this even happening? We buried them. We mourned them. This isn't natural." Before George could respond, the phone rang again. They both jumped, their hearts racing. Neither of them wanted to answer it, but they couldn't just let it ring. With trembling hands, George picked up the receiver. "Hello." This time, there was no voice, just a low, steady hum, like static but deeper, more resonant. It seemed to vibrate in George's chest, filling the room with an almost palpable energy. And then, just as he was about to hang up, a voice broke through the noise. "George, it's not safe. You have to get out." The voice wasn't his mother's this time. It was deeper, more commanding. George's brow furrowed. "Who is this?" The voice didn't answer, but the humming grew louder, more insistent. "They're coming, George. They're coming for you." And then, the line went dead. Over the next few days, the calls became more frequent. Sometimes they would hear familiar voices, loved ones long gone, calling out to them from the other side. Other times, the voices were unfamiliar, strange, and filled with malice. The static on the line seemed to hum with an energy that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. But it wasn't until the children started hearing the voices that things took a darker turn. It was a Sunday morning, and the family was having breakfast when Emily, their 8-year-old daughter, spoke up. "Daddy, why is Grandma calling us?" George's fork froze halfway to his mouth. He turned to his daughter, his face pale. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Emily looked at him with wide, innocent eyes. "She called me last night. She said she missed us. She sounded sad." Maria's hand flew to her mouth. "Emily, when did this happen?" "After you and Daddy went to bed," Emily said matter-of-factly. "She told me not to be scared. She said she just wanted to talk." George and Maria exchanged a horrified look. They hadn't told the children about the calls. How could Emily have known? Jake, their 6-year-old son, chimed in. "I heard Grandpa too. He said he's waiting for us." The blood drained from Maria's face. "Jake, when did you hear this?" Jake shrugged. "Last night. He told me to tell you he's coming soon." The room grew cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made your skin crawl. George stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This has to stop," he muttered. "We need help." Determined to find out what was happening, George began researching the history of the house. He spent hours at the local library, combing through old newspapers and town records. What he found only deepened the mystery. The house had once belonged to a man named Thomas Granger, a wealthy businessman who had lived there in the late 1800s. Granger had been known for his eccentricities, particularly his obsession with contacting the dead. He had held seances in the very room where George and Maria now slept, inviting mediums and spiritualists from all over the country to communicate with the spirits of the afterlife. But something had gone terribly wrong. According to the old records, Granger's wife and 2 children had died under mysterious circumstances, their bodies found lifeless in their beds, as though they had simply stopped living. Granger himself had disappeared shortly after, leaving no trace behind. The house had stood empty for years, its dark history slowly fading into obscurity, until the Harrows had moved in. When George shared this with Maria, her face grew pale. Do you think this has something to do with him?" George nodded grimly. "I think whatever he did here, whatever doors he opened, never closed." The calls continued, more frequent and more insistent. The voices grew angrier, more desperate, and the line between the living and the dead seemed to blur. Objects in the house began to move on their own, doors would slam shut, lights would flicker, and strange cold spots appeared in random places. One night, as George and Maria lay in bed, they were woken by the sound of voices. But this time, the voices weren't coming from the phone. They were coming from the walls. Whispers, soft at first but growing louder, echoed through the house. The voices of their deceased relatives, mingled with the voices of strangers, filled the air, calling out to them, pleading, demanding. George jumped out of bed, his heart pounding. "We need to get the kids," he said, his voice shaking. "We need to get out of here." But as he reached for the door, it slammed shut on its own, trapping them inside. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, vibrating with the force of the voices. Maria screamed as the temperature in the room plummeted, her breath visible in the freezing air. "George, what's happening?" He grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the window. "We have to get out. Now." But as they reached the window, the voices suddenly stopped. The room was silent, the air still, as though nothing had happened. And then, the phone rang. This time, George didn't hesitate. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling. "George," the voice on the other end said, low and menacing. "You can't run from us." It was his mother's voice, but it was different now, darker, more distorted. "We're coming, George. We're coming for you." The line went dead, and the house fell into an eerie silence. And then, the door creaked open on its own. George and Maria stared at each other, terror in their eyes. The dead were no longer just voices on the phone. They were here, in the house, and they weren't going to leave. With the phone calls growing more sinister and the house itself turning against them, George knew they had no choice. They had to leave the house before it was too late. They gathered the children and rushed to the front door, but as George turned the handle, the door wouldn't budge. Behind them, the whispers started again, louder this time, filling the air with a cacophony of voices. The children clung to Maria, their eyes wide with fear. George pounded on the door, desperate to get it open. "We have to get out. We have to." Suddenly, the whispers stopped. For a brief moment, everything was silent. The house seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for something. And then, the phone rang. The sound of the phone ringing felt like a death knell. George's stomach twisted as he turned toward the living room, where the old landline sat on a small wooden table, its shrill ring echoing through the house. He could feel the cold radiating from the phone, as though something malevolent waited on the other end. Maria's voice was barely a whisper. "Don't answer it." But George knew he had no choice. If they were ever going to escape, they needed to confront whatever was haunting them. He walked toward the phone, his footsteps heavy and slow, as if the very air had thickened around him. With trembling fingers, he picked up the receiver. "Hello." His voice cracked as he spoke. For a moment, there was nothing but the low hum of static, so faint it was almost inaudible. But then, a voice broke through, a voice that chilled George to his core. "George, You can't leave. Not yet. It was his mother's voice again, but something was horribly wrong with it. It sounded warped, twisted, as though something far darker was speaking through her. You're part of this now, the voice continued, growing more menacing with each word. You and your family. You belong to us. George gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles turning white. What do you want? Why are you doing this? The voice let out a low, guttural laugh. You should never have come here. The dead don't like to be disturbed, George. But you woke us, and now we're hungry. The line went dead. Before George could process what he'd just heard, the phone rang again. This time, the ring was louder, more urgent, as if the house itself was demanding their attention. But George didn't answer it. He turned to Maria, who stood frozen in the doorway, holding the children close. We need to get out of here, now, George said, his voice shaking. Whatever is happening, it's not going to stop. But before they could take another step, the house responded. The lights in the house flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness before illuminating it again in quick, disorienting bursts. The walls seemed to groan, the wood creaking and shifting as if the house itself were alive. And then, the whispers returned, only this time, they were louder, angrier, filling every corner of the room with a chorus of disembodied voices. Maria screamed as the living room door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. The children clutched her tightly, their wide eyes brimming with terror. Daddy! Emily cried, her voice trembling. What's happening? George didn't have an answer. All he knew was that the house had turned on them, and the spirits, or whatever they were, had no intention of letting them go. As the whispers grew louder, the shadows in the room seemed to shift and twist, taking on grotesque forms. Dark, humanoid shapes began to emerge from the corners of the room, their faces featureless, their bodies distorted by an unnatural darkness that seemed to suck the light from the room. Get back! George shouted, instinctively stepping in front of his family as the shadows moved closer. But the shapes didn't stop. They glided toward them, their movements slow but deliberate, as though savoring their fear. Maria clutched the children to her chest, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. George, what do we do? He looked around wildly, his heart pounding in his chest. There had to be a way out, some way to break the hold these spirits had on them. And then, as if in answer to his frantic thoughts, the phone rang again. The phone's ring was deafening in the otherwise silent room. George stared at it, knowing that answering it was the only way forward, but dreading what he might hear. Slowly, he picked up the receiver. This time, the voice was different. It was neither his mother's nor any familiar relative. It was low, sinister, and filled with a cold malice that chilled George's blood. Leave, the voice hissed. But leave one behind. George's throat tightened. What do you mean? The voice let out a rasping breath. One must stay. The house must take someone. Only then will the rest of you be free. His mind reeled. The spirits were demanding a sacrifice, a soul to replace the ones that had been lost in the house's dark past. George's eyes flicked to his family. Could he really choose? Could he leave one of them behind to save the others? I can't, he stammered, his voice breaking. I can't do that. The voice on the other end snarled, a sound filled with fury. Then none of you will leave. You'll all join us. Suddenly, the shadows in the room surged forward, moving faster than before. The shapes loomed over them, their dark forms swallowing the light. George dropped the phone, his heart racing. He had to make a decision, and fast. But how could he possibly make such a choice? The room grew colder, the oppressive weight of the spirits pressing down on them like a physical force. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and George felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The shadows loomed closer, their twisted forms almost tangible now. Maria's voice broke through the chaos, her tone filled with terror. "George, do something." George clenched his fists, his mind racing. There had to be another way. There had to be something he could do to save his family without making such a horrific sacrifice. But time was running out, and the shadows were closing in. And then, in a moment of clarity, he remembered something from his research, something about Thomas Granger and the rituals he had conducted in the house. The spirits weren't just angry, they were trapped, bound to the house by whatever dark magic Granger had summoned. Maybe, just maybe, he could break the curse. But he would need time. "Maria, take the kids and go upstairs," George said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his insides. "Barricade yourselves in one of the bedrooms. I'll deal with this." Maria looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. "George, no. Go," he shouted, his voice filled with a desperate urgency. "I'll find a way. Just keep them safe." Reluctantly, Maria grabbed the children and rushed up the stairs, her footsteps echoing through the house. As soon as they were gone, George turned back to the shadows. He didn't know how he was going to break the curse, but he knew he had to try. The house was alive with dark energy, and he could feel the weight of the spirits pressing in on him, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. "I won't let you take them," George said through gritted teeth. "Not tonight." The shadows paused, as if considering his defiance. Then, with a low, guttural growl, they lunged toward him. As the shadows lunged at George, he threw himself against the wall, barely dodging their cold, grasping tendrils. His heart pounded in his chest as he frantically searched for a way to fight back. He knew he didn't have much time, his family was counting on him, and the malevolent force in the house was growing stronger by the second. But then, George's eyes landed on something he had overlooked in his earlier research, a small, dusty book sitting on the mantelpiece, its leather cover cracked and worn with age. He had seen the book before but hadn't thought much of it. Now, in the midst of the chaos, he realized it might be the key to everything. Darting across the room, George grabbed the book and flipped it open, his fingers trembling as he scanned the ancient, yellowed pages. It was written in Latin, but some of the symbols and words were familiar enough to give him a sense of what it was, a ritual, an incantation that could break the bond between the spirits and the house. His breath caught in his throat. This was his chance, his only chance. But as he read further, his stomach twisted in horror. The ritual required a sacrifice. Not of flesh or blood, but of life energy. Someone had to offer themselves to the spirits willingly, pouring their essence into the house to sever the ties that held the dead in place. Without the sacrifice, the spirits would remain trapped, forever haunting the living. George's mind raced. Could he do it? Could he offer himself up to save his family? If he performed the ritual, the spirits would be freed, but it would cost him his life. And even then, there was no guarantee it would work. The house might demand more. But what other choice did he have? The whispers grew louder, and the shadows pressed in on George, their cold presence like a suffocating weight on his chest. His mind flashed to Maria and the children, huddled upstairs, terrified and waiting for him to save them. He couldn't let them down. He couldn't let the house win. With trembling hands, George began to chant the incantation from the book, his voice shaky at first but growing stronger as he pushed through the fear. The air around him seemed to vibrate with power, and the shadows recoiled, retreating slightly as the ancient words filled the room. The house groaned in protest, its walls creaking as if something deep within its foundation was stirring. The spirits, sensing what George was attempting, howled in fury, their voices blending into a deafening roar. But George didn't stop. He continued the chant, his voice rising above the cacophony, forcing the spirits back. But then, as he neared the end of the ritual, the book slipped from his hands, the final line of the incantation unfinished. Suddenly, the house shook violently, and the shadows surged forward, more aggressive than ever. George stumbled back, panic rising in his chest. He had to finish the ritual, but the shadows were closing in, their cold, skeletal hands reaching for him. "George! Maria's voice echoed from upstairs, filled with terror. He couldn't let them die. Not like this. Summoning every ounce of courage he had left, George reached for the book, his fingers brushing the pages just as the shadows closed in around him. He screamed the final line of the incantation, his voice hoarse and desperate, as the shadows engulfed him. For a moment, everything went still. The house fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. The shadows froze, hovering just inches from George, their dark forms quivering as if unsure of what to do next. And then, with a deafening crack, the walls of the house began to split open, beams of light bursting through the darkness. The shadows screeched, writhing in pain as the light seared through them, tearing them apart. The air was filled with the sound of their screams, a high-pitched, otherworldly wail that sent shivers down George's spine. But the light wasn't just destroying the spirits, it was draining George, too. He could feel his life force slipping away, the energy from his body being pulled into the house. His vision blurred, and a deep, bone-deep exhaustion settled over him. He had done it, he had broken the curse. But it was costing him everything. As his legs gave out beneath him, George collapsed to the floor, his strength fading fast. The shadows were gone now, their presence obliterated by the ritual, but the house still crackled with residual energy. He could feel it pulsing through the floorboards, like the beating of a heart. Upstairs, Maria rushed to the children's room, her heart pounding. She had heard George's scream and the sounds of the house tearing apart, but now, there was an eerie stillness that filled the air. She called his name, but there was no response. With the children clinging to her, Maria cautiously made her way downstairs. When she reached the living room, her breath caught in her throat. George lay motionless on the floor, his body pale and still, the ancient book beside him. "George," she cried, running to his side. She shook him, her tears falling freely. "George, please, wake up." But he didn't stir. The room was quiet now, the oppressive weight of the spirits gone, but Maria felt no relief. The house had taken its toll, and it had claimed George in the process. His sacrifice had saved them, but it had also taken him from them. Suddenly, a soft breeze blew through the open window, carrying with it the faintest whisper. "Maria." It was George's voice, faint and distant, but unmistakable. She froze, her breath catching in her chest as she listened. "Take the children, leave this place, don't look back." Maria sobbed, clutching George's lifeless hand as the breeze faded. She knew he was gone, but somehow, he was still with them, guiding them, protecting them, even in death. Gathering her strength, Maria stood, wiping away her tears. She knew what she had to do. She had to leave the house, just as George had said. For her children, for herself, and for him. With one last look at George's body, Maria turned and led the children out of the house. The air outside was crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere inside. As they walked down the front steps, Maria glanced back at the house one final time. It stood silent and still, its dark windows reflecting nothing but emptiness. And then, as the door swung shut behind them, the house let out a final, creaking sigh, as though it, too, was finally at peace. Weeks later, the house stood abandoned once more, its dark history buried beneath layers of dust and silence. No one spoke of the Harrows, and no one dared to enter its doors. The town moved on, but the memory of the house lingered like a shadow, a whispered warning to those who lived nearby. And late at night, when the wind blew just right, some said you could still hear the faintest sound, a phone ringing in the distance. But no one ever answered. The Black Lake. The lake had always been a mystery, a dark, glassy expanse nestled deep in the forest. Its water was as still as death, and even in the brightest sunlight, it never seemed to glimmer. Locals called it Black Hollow Lake, and they whispered rumors about it, how no fish swam in its depths, how no birds landed on its surface, and how strange noises could be heard if you stood near it long enough. People avoided it, except for a few brave souls or foolish adventurers looking for a thrill. For years, it had stood as a silent, eerie backdrop in the town of Millfield. But that all changed when 3 people went missing on a warm autumn day. They had been camping in the nearby woods, and the last anyone saw of them was when they went to take a swim in the lake. The authorities searched for days but found nothing, no bodies, no footprints, not even a scrap of clothing. The lake seemed to swallow them whole. The town moved on, but for a group of friends, Emma, Max, Jamie, and Lily, the mystery of the Black Hollow Lake became an obsession. They had grown up together, often venturing into the woods for camping trips and late-night adventures, but they had never dared go near the lake. Now, as the town whispered of ancient curses and dark forces lurking beneath the water, the group found themselves irresistibly drawn to the idea of solving the mystery. They decided to go to the lake one final time before the cold of winter set in. They wanted answers. The air was crisp with the early bite of autumn, and the leaves crunched underfoot as the 4 friends hiked toward Black Hollow Lake. It was late afternoon, and the sun cast long shadows through the trees. None of them spoke much on the way there, each lost in their own thoughts. Emma, the most practical of the group, had her doubts. "We shouldn't be doing this," she said quietly, breaking the silence. "You all heard the stories. People don't just disappear like that." Max, who always had a knack for brushing off danger, shrugged. "They probably just got lost. I mean, there's nothing supernatural about a bunch of idiots wandering too far into the woods." Jamie, ever the thrill-seeker, grinned. "Or maybe the lake really is cursed. Either way, I say we're gonna be the ones to figure it out." Lily, the quietest of the group, hadn't said much since they decided to come. She had always been sensitive to things, dreams, feelings, and sometimes, things she couldn't quite explain. As they approached the lake, she felt a deep unease, as though something was watching them from the shadows. But she kept her fear to herself. When they finally reached the lake, its surface looked even darker and more foreboding than any of them had imagined. The water was eerily still, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror, and the trees around the shore seemed to bend inward, as though they were trying to hide the lake from the world. Max threw his bag down near the shore, stretching his arms. "Well, here we are. Doesn't look so scary, does it?" But the others didn't respond. They all felt it, that creeping sensation of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. Lily shivered and wrapped her arms around herself. She could swear she heard a faint whisper on the wind, a voice that sounded like it was calling her name. As night began to fall, Jamie, ever eager for excitement, suggested they go for a swim. "Come on, we didn't hike all this way just to stand around staring at it. Let's see what's under there." Emma scoffed. "You've got to be kidding. It's freezing." Max, always up for a dare, smirked. "I'll do it if Jamie does." Jamie was already stripping down to his swim trunks, undeterred by the cold or the sinister reputation of the lake. "See you on the other side," he said with a wink, before diving into the dark water with a splash. The sound of his dive echoed across the lake, and the ripples spread outward, disturbing the glassy surface. Max followed suit, and for a moment, the 2 friends splashed around, laughing and shouting as though they were at any ordinary lake. But then, something changed. Jamie went under, diving deep, but when he surfaced, his face was pale, his eyes wide with confusion. There's something down there," he stammered. "Something big." Max, laughing nervously, swam toward him. "You're just freaking yourself out. Come on, it's probably just a rock or something." But Jamie shook his head. No, I felt it. It moved." Suddenly, the water around them began to ripple, not from their movement, but from something else. Emma and Lily, watching from the shore, felt a chill run down their spines. The ripples grew larger, more violent, as though something massive was rising from the depths. "Get out of the water!" Emma shouted, her voice breaking the eerie silence. But it was too late. Max let out a yell as something grabbed him, pulling him under the water with terrifying speed. Jamie swam frantically toward the shore, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Help! Help me!" he screamed. Emma and Lily rushed forward, grabbing Jamie's hands and pulling him onto the shore just as the water exploded behind him. A massive shadow, impossibly large and shapeless, rose from the lake, its dark tendrils reaching for them. In a panic, they ran, not stopping until they were deep in the woods, far from the lake. Their hearts pounded in their chests, the adrenaline pumping through their veins. Max was gone, swallowed by whatever lurked beneath the black water. The group, now huddled together in the darkness, tried to make sense of what had just happened. Jamie was shaking, his eyes wide with terror. "It wasn't an animal," he whispered. "It was something else. Something alive." Lily, who had been silent this whole time, finally spoke. "I think the lake is alive," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And it wants something from us." Emma frowned. "What do you mean? That's ridiculous." But Lily shook her head, her face pale. "I've been dreaming about this place. About the water. It's been calling to me, and now that we're here, I can feel it. It's angry. It took Max because we disturbed it." Jamie, still trembling, looked at Lily with a mixture of fear and desperation. "What do we do? We have to get him back. We can't just leave him." Lily's eyes were distant, as though she were listening to something only she could hear. "The lake doesn't give things back," she said softly. "Not without a price." The group decided they couldn't leave without trying to save Max. They returned to the lake the next morning, armed with ropes, flashlights, and anything else they could think of. But the lake was even more foreboding in the early dawn light, its surface black and unmoving, as though it were waiting for them. Jamie, determined to find his friend, volunteered to go down again. They tied a rope around his waist, and he waded into the water, his heart pounding in his chest. The cold was unbearable, and as he swam out toward the center of the lake, he could feel the weight of the darkness below pulling him down. He took a deep breath and dove. The water was colder than he had imagined, and as he descended, the light from above quickly faded. He switched on his flashlight, but the beam barely penetrated the murky depths. The further he went, the more he felt as though the lake were swallowing him, pulling him deeper into its abyss. And then, he saw it. At first, it was just a shape, something massive and dark, shifting in the water. But as he swam closer, he realized it wasn't just a shape. It was something alive. It was as if the lake itself had formed a creature, monstrous, shifting mass of shadows and tendrils that writhed beneath the surface. And there, caught in its grasp, was Max. His body was limp, suspended in the water, his eyes closed. The creature's tendrils were wrapped around him, pulling him deeper into the dark. Jamie felt a surge of panic, but he forced himself to swim closer. He reached out, grabbing Max by the arm, but as soon as he touched him, the creature reacted. Its tendrils lashed out, wrapping around Jamie's legs, pulling him down. He struggled, kicking and thrashing, but the more he fought, the tighter the creature's grip became. Just as he was about to lose consciousness, he felt a sharp tug on the rope around his waist. The others were pulling him back. With one final effort, he kicked free of the creature's grasp and was hauled to the surface, gasping for air. But Max was still down there, lost to the darkness. Back on the shore, Jamie collapsed, coughing and shivering from the cold. Emma and Lily rushed to his side, but the look in his eyes told them everything they needed to know. "He's still down there," Jamie whispered. "But I couldn't get him." Lily knelt by the water's edge, her eyes fixed on the still surface. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. She could hear them calling her name, beckoning her to come closer. "I have to go down," she said suddenly, standing up. Emma grabbed her arm. "Are you insane? We barely got Jamie out alive. That thing is down there, waiting." But Lily shook her head. It's the only way. I can feel it. The lake, it wants something. It's not going to let us leave unless we give it what it wants. Emma stared at her in disbelief. And what does it want? Lily's voice was barely audible as she answered, me. Lily stepped into the water, her movements slow and deliberate. She felt the coldness seeping into her bones, but she didn't hesitate. The lake's whispers were growing louder, urging her on. Behind her, Emma and Jamie watched in horror, unsure of what to do. They wanted to stop her, to pull her back, but something in Lily's eyes told them that this was the only way. Lily waded out until she was waist deep, then she dove. The water closed over her head, and the world above disappeared. As she descended into the dark water, she could feel the presence of the creature all around her. Its tendrils brushed against her skin, cold and slimy, but she didn't fight. She let it pull her deeper, down into the abyss. And then, she saw it, Max, still caught in the creature's grasp. His eyes were open now, but they were empty, as though the life had been drained from him. Lily swam closer, and as she did, she felt the creature's tendrils wrap around her. But instead of pulling her under, they held her gently, as though they were cradling her. The whispers in her mind grew louder, clearer. The lake wanted her. It wanted her to stay, to become part of it. And in exchange, it would let Max go. Lily closed her eyes, letting the darkness take her. She felt the cold seep into her very soul, felt the tendrils wrap around her heart. But as she surrendered, she whispered one final plea. Let him go. On the shore, Emma and Jamie waited in tense silence. Minutes passed, and there was no sign of Lily or Max. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the lake. The water was still, eerily calm, as though nothing had ever happened. Just as they were about to lose hope, the surface of the lake rippled. A figure emerged from the water, Max. He staggered onto the shore, gasping for breath, his eyes wide with confusion. Emma and Jamie rushed to his side, helping him to his feet. But there was no sign of Lily. She's still down there, Max stammered, his voice hoarse. She saved me. They looked out over the dark water, but the lake was silent once again. Whatever had happened beneath the surface, whatever deal had been made, Lily was gone. The lake had claimed her, just as it had claimed so many others before. And as the last light of day faded, Emma and Jamie realized that the lake would never be truly still. It would always whisper, always hunger, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. The end.